What if the moon drew nearer, gliding across the sky so close that it seemed no longer like a distant lantern, but a vast, breathing neighbor, filling almost the whole horizon? We are used to its patience, to its steadiness, to the quiet comfort of something that has never rushed us. But imagine, just for a moment, that its slow orbit was folded in half, that the invisible thread of gravity pulled it toward us, until its presence became overwhelming, luminous, undeniable. Twice as close, twice as heavy, twice as near in every whisper of the tides and shadows. The earth as we know it would not stay the same. The seas would lean toward the moon like restless sleepers leaning into a dream. The gentle breathing of tides, the rhythm we accept as ordinary, would swell into something stranger, more powerful, more insistent. Shorelines would groan under water rising higher than mountains of memory, only to retreat and return with endless persistence. Whole continents would feel the weight of this new relationship, the tender yet merciless embrace of a gravity too close to ignore. We know the moon has always helped to steady our world. Its pull anchors the tilt of our planet's axis, keeping our seasons from spinning into wild disorder. But with the moon nearer, that balance might tighten or unravel. Ice ages and warm ages might arrive faster, cycles of climate stitched closer together, like a clock winding too quickly. Years, centuries, and millennia might move differently. Beneath our feet, stones would not wait quite so long to erode. Sands might shift faster, cliffs turning to dust sooner than memory expects. Deep time itself, once so patient, would learn a new, restless tempo. In the layers of geology, this would be written like music changing tempo mid-song. Sediments would arrive faster, coastlines would etch and re-etch their scars upon the earth. Fossils, those quiet echoes of what once breathed, might appear in abundance along shifting shores, only to vanish again, swallowed into the subduction zones of the planet and carried into molten silence. A closer moon would not simply rearrange the present, it would rewrite the memory of the earth itself. Perhaps we have forgotten how much memory hides inside stone. Each isotope, each grain, each crystalline fracture records time differently, patiently accumulating its story. But if the moon were nearer, would that record keep the same calm pulse? Or would erosion blur those archives more quickly, making history harder to hold on to? Could we ever know what was truly lost? Or would we live inside a world where forgetting was the rule, not the exception? And then there is the human eye. To stand beneath such a moon would be to know intimacy with the heavens in a way we cannot now. Craters would show their depth to us without telescope or lens. Valleys, ridges, and ancient scars from when the solar system was young would press into our dreams. Night would no longer be night in the same way, for the brightness would be too constant, too large to escape. Shadows would sharpen. Stars would fade in the flood of silver. Sleep itself might be rewoven under this larger light, our bodies responding in ways we cannot yet imagine. Could we even rest properly under such fullness? Or would our dreams bend and shimmer, forever haunted by the vast eye above us? The moon closer would be no gentle visitor. It would be both gift and burden, both stabilizer and stormbringer. It would not simply sit in the background, it would dominate, it would command. Not because it wishes to, not because it has intent, but because gravity is indifferent. And yet, in that indifference, there is poetry. In that indifference, we might feel a lesson about closeness, about distance, about how fragile our balance really is. What draws us to imagine this is not fear, but wonder. Because even now, even where it is, the moon shapes us in ways we scarcely notice. It shapes tides. It shapes time. It shapes the very length of our days. And if such power rests in distance, what might awaken if distance disappeared? And so we step into this thought gently, not to predict, not to fear, but simply to listen. To listen to the quiet hum of what could be. If the moon leaned toward us, if its silver face was not there but here. The doorway opens slowly, inviting us into a landscape we have never walked before. A world not of one Earth but of two, our planet, and the presence that pulls it ever closer into a dance without end. And this dance will not stop at the seas or the seasons, for the sky itself, too, begins to change, the sky itself begins to change, reshaped by the nearness of the moon. Where once it was a companion, small enough to rest in the curve of a hand, now it overwhelms the horizon. Its disk spreads wide, larger than any sun we have ever seen, its face filling the night with textures so vivid they no longer seem distant. Plains, mountains, valleys, and scars from ancient impacts no longer belong only to telescopes. They are inscribed directly into memory, written across the sky as though painted upon it. No longer remote, no longer subtle, the moon becomes almost Earth-like in its intimacy. A second world hanging so near that it seems one could simply walk toward it if only the air would allow. We imagine the detail of every crater, each one an echo of a forgotten collision. Some scars stretch for hundreds of kilometers, hidden now by distance, but in this closer sky they are impossible to ignore. They whisper of deep time, of chaos and beginnings, of a solar system young and violent. To look at this moon up close would be to look into a mirror of memory itself, a reminder that nothing, not even worlds, remain untouched by entropy. And yet, from Earth, those broken surfaces might appear beautiful, delicate in their precision, glowing softly as if time itself had been illuminated. The stars, too, would fade under this giant presence. Where once we tilted our heads back and beheld galaxies and constellations, now they dissolve in the halo of reflected sunlight. Night itself would no longer be truly dark. Shadows would lengthen and sharpen, defined not only by the sun by day but by the moon by night, doubling our sense of direction, creating illusions of two worlds overlapping, two skies woven together. Perhaps this is why we might call it the sky of two moons. Not because there are two, but because our experience is doubled, transformed, multiplied in depth and presence. Sleep beneath such a sky would change. Imagine lying under the glow, the silver light seeping through forests, across oceans, down mountainsides. Even with eyes closed, its brightness would press against the mind. Perhaps circadian rhythms would struggle. Perhaps dreams would alter, turned more vivid or more restless beneath so much illumination. Could we, as creatures, relearn how to sleep beneath night that is no longer night, but a second kind of day? And if the quality of night changes, does the quality of memory change, too? Maybe sleep, the deep forgetting and deep remembering we rely on each cycle, would take on another character entirely. In such a sky, every story humans tell would change as well. Ancient peoples who once used the moon as a clock and compass might have seen in this nearness a god too grand to ignore. Temples might rise not just toward it, but in direct imitation of the craters and ridges now impossible to overlook. Myths of eyes in the sky, faces among shadows, mountains above mountains, would grow stronger. Perhaps even our present lives would bend inward toward reverence. For how could we not look upward, endlessly, every time night falls, when a second Earth stares back at us so clearly? And yet, such a moon is not only myth, but science written visibly in the heavens. Its brightness, its proximity, would amplify the pull of tides, the push of climate, the mixing of atmosphere. Every effect of its gravity, large or gentle, would now reveal itself plainly in the way sky, sea, and land behave. The illusion of separation between Earth and moon would dissolve. We would no longer see them as two bodies apart, but as dancers bound, endlessly circling one another, neither complete without the other. Perhaps this is what it means to live under a closer moon, to feel its presence not just in tide charts or astronomical calendars, but in our bones, our sleeps, our myths, our very sense of identity. Not because it chooses to shape us, not because it intends to, but simply because gravity sings, and all of us, from the smallest stone to the tallest wave, cannot help but hear it. We live beneath its gaze. We dream beneath its surface. We carry it in tides and in language alike. And if the sight of a closer moon can change so much within us, rewriting night and memory, reshaping our silence beneath the stars, then what else, what hidden forces, might reveal themselves when the seas begin to follow such a giant light more powerfully than ever before? If the sight of a nearer moon could change our sense of sky, then the pull of its gravity would change the earth beneath our feet even more. The oceans, those restless mirrors of the heavens, would not remain calm under its doubled presence. They would swell higher, rise further, lean harder into its call. Tides that now whisper gently against the shore would strike with the weight of mountains, their peaks and troughs as dramatic as valleys and cliffs. Twice as close means twice the pull, and so the breathing of the sea would no longer be subtle. It would be thunderous, unignorable, a heartbeat louder than storms. Shorelines we think of as permanent would dissolve into impermanence. Beaches, coves, and deltas would vanish each day, only to return hours later remade in new shapes. Harbors would flood, then empty. Salt marshes would bloom wide and then collapse back into mudflats. Whole landscapes would live on the edge of disappearance, flickering like memories half-kept, half-forgotten. A coastline would no longer be a line at all, but a shifting threshold, an eroded sketch redrawn twice daily by gravity. Perhaps humanity itself would be forced to abandon its habit of permanence, choosing instead a more fluid way of living, homes and cities fashioned not of stone but of movement. Such tides would drive energy deep into the body of the earth. Currents would churn faster, carrying heat, salt, and nutrients farther than before. The oceans would mix themselves with renewed intensity, redistributing life and memory in ways we cannot now witness. Coral reefs would feel crushing stress as saltwater swept over them with cycles too tall, too violent for delicate organisms to hold on. Some reefs might crumble, their skeletons dissolving into carbonate sands, their ancient builders erased. And yet, with destruction might also come creation. As coastlines fracture into lagoons, as fish and plankton drift with new pathways, as life adapts to rhythms strange but survivable, geology itself would listen to these tides. Sediments once layered gently across continental shelves would be ripped apart, scattered into trenches, dragged into subduction zones where ocean floors are swallowed and melted into the mantle. Fossilization, that careful patience of mineral time, might be hastened or undone entirely. What would survive in stone if tides this great scoured coastlines every day? Would our future paleontologists, millions of years from now, find records of life by the sea? Or would too much have been erased, the fossils broken before they could harden, the isotope trails washed away before they could mark their quiet signatures? Memory written in mud may vanish if mud itself no longer lingers. And yet, what a sight this world would become. To stand and watch tides like breathing mountains rise and fall would be to watch the planet in motion, alive in a way more than metaphor. Each ascent of water is not only a flood but an inhalation. Each retreat not only an exposure but an exhalation. Perhaps we would begin to see the earth itself as a living being, lungs swelling with the pull of the moon, exhaling to reveal coasts shimmering with wet silence. Perhaps we would measure our days not by the sun's progression, but by these towering breaths, the mountains of the sea lifting against the horizon, then collapsing back again. And with this shift in perspective comes a quiet question. What of us? If continents are no longer still, if tides erase more than they preserve, who will we become in this landscape? Will we cling, as we always have, to memory, to structure, to markings in stone, and find them washed away, dissolved daily by the ocean's new appetite? Or would we learn another way of remembering, a way made of fluidity, of movement, of letting go again and again? Maybe this, too, is memory. Not a permanence, but an endless surrender to the forces that shape life larger than we are. And yet, if tides this vast can erase the ground beneath us, what storms might they awaken in the air above, where clouds and winds take their commands from the heaving sea? The answer is written in the invisible geometry of gravity. A moon twice as close would not only lift oceans but stir the very breath of the planet. Currents quickened by strange tides would pulse heat into the atmosphere, and winds, restless and newly born, would gather power as though they too had been pulled nearer. Storms would no longer be gentle interruptions. They would become the planet's second language, each gust an echo of the moon's gravity sung into the sky. Rain would fall differently beneath this influence. It would carry more of the ocean upward, more salt, more warmth, more memory. Monsoons might run longer, hurricanes might circle wider, storm seasons overlapping until they felt less like seasons at all, and more like the natural state of things. Entire coastlines would vanish not through slow erosion alone, but through sudden breathless storms rewriting geography in a single night. It would seem less like weather and more like remembering, a planet recalling its ancient ability to return continents to the sea. What we call catastrophe might simply be, in this alternate Earth, the ordinary. In this storm-swept world, civilizations would find themselves chased by the tide not only from below but also from above. Imagine cities heavy with history, their architecture the work of centuries, undone in weeks by the constant cycle of water and wind. Ancient roads buried by silt, towers stepped in salt until they crumble into sand, steel skeletons corroded more quickly than memory can preserve them. The moon above would not speak the language of permanence. It would tell us, gently but surely, nothing is fixed. Not stone, not steel, not even the ideas we build within them. What then of fossils, of archives, of memory itself? Under storms forever fed by swollen tides, the patience required for fossilization might falter. Bones might be carried miles away before sediments can cradle them. Layers of stone that could have become entire epochs in the geologic record might be broken, recycled back into turbulent seas. Entire assemblages of living and dying may leave behind only fragments, scattered beyond use, beyond recognition. Perhaps whole ages would slip through the sieve of time, not because life did not thrive, but because life could never remain still long enough to be remembered in stone. Maybe each storm would act as history's eraser, leaving blank pages where there might have been chapters. And yet, strangely, the same turbulence might carve new forms of preservation, new shapes of memory. Objects drawn into the deep by stronger subduction would leave behind unusual isotope trails, chemical fingerprints etched into the crust far earlier than they might have been otherwise. Storms could scatter memory, but they might also entomb it in unexpected places. Artifacts buried in far sands, traces of human endeavors drifting to remote depths. Could it be that a sharper, harsher cycle of climate would indeed erase histories, but also scatter echoes more widely, seeding memory across hidden places of the globe? Perhaps time itself in this closer moon world is less about continuity and more about fragments. Pieces of memory rising and sinking, appearing and then dissolving again. And what of us, standing amid the silence after each storm has passed? The air heavy with the scent of salt and the echoes of vanished walls? Would we learn to see memory not as something built into stones and fossils, but as something transient like clouds always there and then gone? Not because it is weak, but because impermanence is its shape. Maybe civilizations under such a sky would come to understand themselves differently. Maybe people would live closer to the moment, shaping culture to endure not in monuments but in songs, not in stone but in shared silence, as if expecting the sea to one day return for everything built on land. Storm-tossed histories would be less linear, less clean. They would be histories of interruption, of fragments scattered by winds, of memories dissolved in water. A world where the line between past and present could never harden would be a world of fluid memory, always reshaped, never still. And if history itself can be scattered by the sea and rewritten by the sky, then what of the seasons that guide not only storms but every rhythm of life on Earth? To imagine the moon closer is to imagine a planet tipped differently upon its axis, for the moon, even at its current distance, is our stabilizer. Its gravity presses against the wobble of our world, anchoring the tilt of Earth's spin, and in that tilt lives the story of our seasons. With the moon nearer, this balance would not be the same. It might become more rigid, holding the planet still like a tightened string, or perhaps too rigid, too direct, allowing any disruption to cascade into deeper swings. The difference of a few degrees would mean more than we can first suppose. It would be the difference between winters that last longer than memories and summers so brief they feel like moments. Seasons are not only weather, they are memory carved into the biosphere. Plants awaken to their timing, storing sugars, unleashing flowers, dying back into soil with a patience guided by rhythm. Animals follow, breeding and migrating not by choice, but by genetic remembrance of temperature and light. If the moon closer reshaped those cues, whole ecosystems would lose their clocks. A forest might awaken too soon, leaves unfurling before the frost has fully ended. Fields might wither in expectant droughts that never arrive, or in rains that come too fast. Migration paths carved into memory over thousands of years would bend out of sync, each cycle unraveling into uncertainty. What if the very music of life grew dissonant, each voice still singing, but the harmony forever altered? Geology, too, would keep the records of this tilt reshaping, but not in a way easy for us to read now. In ice sheets, isotopes would preserve signatures of new climates, oxygen marking the dance of warmth and cold repeating at new tempos. Lakes and soils would trap pollen from plants thriving or suffering under the shifting cycles. Fossils would capture echoes of species that endured and those that did not, and deep within their bones, elemental traces would whisper of skies heavier with snow or air thicker with heat. Already our rocks hold evidence of ancient tilts, when the axis wandered without the moon strong enough to steady it. These epochs mark times of chaos, with ice stretching toward the equator and deserts swallowing fertile ground. Could a nearer moon move us back into that kind of turbulence, or into something entirely new, a stability so tight it strangles diversity before it can unfold? It is not only biology and stone that would know the shift, our perception of time itself would change. Without steady seasons, the length of years would feel different to us. If a single summer stretched awkwardly long, would memory itself become blurred, our sense of age distorted? If winters arrived unpredictably, would cultures stop counting years as they do, turning instead to some other rhythm, tides, winds, even storms, as new calendars of existence? Perhaps human memory would reshape itself to match Earth's new song, keeping history not in tidy seasons of planting and harvest, but in fluid tales of strange winters and uncanny springs. What would it mean for us if the very concept of time was no longer trustworthy? If even the tilt of the planet betrayed us? And in that thought lies something humbling. We imagine ourselves steady, seated in history, but we are only passengers of a planet forever adjusting. The moon closer is not only brighter in the sky, not only stronger in the sea, but more insistent in the quiet math of rotation and tilt. We may think of stability as a gift, but what if change is the truer nature of things? Perhaps memory itself exists only because of rhythm, and if rhythm alters, then memory alters with it. Maybe not, but beneath this speculation we feel a subtle truth, that whether steady or shifting, the balance of tilt and rhythm decides not only the climate of Earth but also the climate of our minds. And yet, if the tilt of the world can shape the breath of life, how much deeper might its closeness reach, into the very crust of continents, the trembling mantle below, where gravity's tug begins to reshape stone and fire itself. A nearer moon does not only command the tides of water, it commands the tides of rock. The Earth itself breathes more heavily under the strain, as its outer shell flexes and yields. What seems to us solid and permanent is neither. Much of Earth is fluid this deep down, a slow river of mantle creeping beneath our feet, and the moon pulls at it ceaselessly. Draw the moon nearer, and that pull grows stronger, awakening movement in stone we never imagined could move. Volcanoes, already the planet's restless exhalations, would breathe heavier under this intimacy. Magma, stirred like water in a basin, rises closer to the surface, eager for release. Eruptions would not be constant, but they might be more frequent, flaring in new places where tectonic plates are stretched thin. Mountain belts built through millions of years of collision might strain taller, their rise accelerated by new stresses. Faults that have waited for centuries, storing their tension in the quiet dark, would give way sooner, shuddering through valleys and plains. It would not be chaos, but the subtle reminder that Earth itself is a body subject to gravity, as much alive as seas and skies. Even earthquakes, those echoes of subterranean stresses, would take on a new rhythm beneath the closeness of the moon. The timing of their slip might align more strongly with phases of that looming orb overhead, as if the Earth and moon beat together in a doubled pulse. Some fractures would close, some would open wider, their traces recorded in isotope trails and locked in the crystallizing minerals of molten pools. The planet would write its memory differently, carving new inscriptions into stone archives, histories of deep tremor and fire guided not by chance but by lunar intimacy. Deep time, so often imagined as slow, patient, unbending, would start shifting under this gravity. The processes that seem invisible to us because they stretch across millions of years might begin to move within shorter spans. Centuries where once it took ages, ages compressed into rhythms almost graspable. Perhaps mountain ranges would not need 50 million years to rise, but a fraction of that. Perhaps ocean basins would subduct sooner, swallowing crust before its sediments could tell their full story. In this, entropy takes on another face, not the slow erasure we are used to, but an accelerated forgetting, a faster blurring of geological memory. What then becomes of fossils, of ancient imprints held beneath these restless plates? A closer moon does not simply rewrite the surface, it churns the archives of life. Fossil beds preserved along tectonic boundaries might be subducted faster, dissolved back into heat before their stories could fully harden. Entire epochs of life might vanish deep into the mantle, erased as though they never were. Perhaps this reshaped geology would leave future archaeologists and paleontologists with gaps, sudden silences in the timeline, records lost not because life was absent, but because the moon's nearness hastened the swallowing of stone itself. Could it be possible that memory, instead of building steadily downward in neat strata, would become scattered, discontinuous, broken, and incomplete? And yet, there is also creation hidden here. For every continent cracked, new crust would be born along ridges alive with magma. For every plain drowned in lava, minerals would recrystallize, new gemstones and ores forming with signatures unique to this altered earth. The cycle of decay and renewal becomes quicker, sharper, its tempo set not by the patience of ages but by the closeness of a single celestial partner. We might call it loss, but perhaps it is simply another rhythm, one where the earth composes its story with more urgency, as though unwilling to wait. Maybe, if we could stand in the far future and cut into the planet's crust like a book, we would find strange chapters here. Layers thicker, then thinner, no steady pacing, only bursts of story followed by silence. Maybe what we think of as permanent mountains, cratons, even whole coastlines, would show instead as restless, provisional in a way we have never known them. And if Earth itself, the body we stand upon, owns no permanence, what then of us? Our civilizations, our monuments, our marks in stone, they would be smaller ripples still, folded into a geology hurrying itself toward erasure. But if the nearness of the moon could shake stone and stir fire, if even the crust of Earth can become less steady under its gaze, then what echoes would linger in the fossils themselves, in the ancient shells and bones that lie waiting there, pressed beneath changing tides of sediment? Fossils are not only remnants of creatures, they are remnants of time itself. They are whispers of particular conditions. A lagoon stilled enough for bones to settle, a shoreline gentle enough for imprints to harden, a burial swift enough to protect what might otherwise be erased. To imagine the moon closer is to imagine those conditions altered, over and over, endlessly disturbed by tides too impatient to allow calm. Would earlier life have endured these cycles differently? In shallow seas, ammonites once spiraled upward into vast numbers, their shells falling to the seabed in layers thick as memories. Trilobites scurried across ancient sands, horseshoe crabs pressed tracks that hardened only when tides retreated long enough to let sediment dry. If tides had been taller, faster, stranger, would these records have survived? Or would their trails have been washed away before stone could form, the memory of their existence erased not because they did not live, but because the planet was too restless to keep their traces? Perhaps entire chapters of life's library would be missing, not from extinction, but from a failure of preservation, a silence deeper than absence. In a closer moon Earth, fossilization itself might become rarer by the shores but more common in the depths. Higher tides would push remains into deeper basins, burying them under thicker sediments. Bones carried seaward by powerful tidal currents might escape the violence of erosion long enough to be cradled in mud. Fossils would form, but they would tell a different story. Less of coasts and lagoons, more of open waters, turbulence, and drift. Whole classes of life might vanish from our sight, not because they failed, but because we cannot see them across the veil of lost preservation. Maybe what paleontology reveals to us is less a story of what was, and more a story of what was kept. And under a closer moon, the keeping would change. Entropy governs even in fossils. Bones mineralize, but they also decay. Shells strengthen, but they also dissolve. Tiny isotope trails mark the age of their formation but fade as atoms shift and transform. The longer fossils wait to be discovered, the more they surrender their precision. Push the moon downward toward us, double its tug, and the waiting becomes shorter, the erasures quicker, the cycles of burial and destruction faster. Deep time, which relies on patience, begins to blur. We imagine that once a fossil forms, it is eternal, locked in stone. But this is not true. Pressure collapses it, tectonics fracture it, water dissolves it, heat consumes it. The record of life is fragile, far more fragile than the life itself ever was. Under another rhythm of tides, that fragility is amplified to the point where we might barely know what the ancient world once contained. Could it be that what we call prehistory is already a world of missing voices, and in this imagined earth that silence would be magnified? Yet fossils are more than imprints and bones. They are metaphors written in stone. They tell us that life wants to be remembered, that even in silence, memory can endure in shells and shadows. In a world shaped by a closer moon, perhaps new metaphors would take form. Fossil beds would not speak of stability or continuity, but of fluidity, of life adapting to restlessness, of creatures written into rock in one tide and erased in the next. Our planet would hold fewer monuments in sediment, but perhaps more faint impressions scattered everywhere, as if history itself became a spray of whispers rather than a book of chapters. And perhaps, if the moon were nearer, we would look at fossils differently. We would not see them as anchors of truth, but as echoes, a chorus of what almost vanished, what barely survived the erasures of water and stone. Maybe we would lean closer to those faint expressions, cherishing them not for their completeness but for their incompleteness, for the silence loud enough to remind us how fragile memory is. And if even fossils, the supposed keepers of time, can be so easily lost to the moon's pull, then what does that mean for the shadows it casts each night? The ways in which even darkness itself might be reshaped by so near a presence. A moon nearer to the earth would not only command tides and tremors but light as well, light reflected upon every surface, carving shadows deeper and sharper than we have ever known. Shadows exist because of distance, because of contrast, because of a balance between glow and obscurity. But if the moon were twice as close, the line between brightness and dark would change. Every stone would wear two silhouettes. Every tree, every rooftop, every creature that moved would seem doubled, stitched into the landscape by needle lines of darkness edged in silver. Darkness itself would no longer feel light. It would thicken under the weight of this amplified reflection, gaining presence where once it was only absence. Imagine standing under such a sky, the ground beneath you mapped twice, your body outlined by both the sun's memory and the moon's insistence. Even faces would change. Every glance illuminated by doubled contrast. Every expression framed more severely by the overpresence of shadow. What would it mean to live in such illumination, where the night denied its own softness and grew strict, more watchful, as though the moon itself were a second vigilance in the sky? The length of shadow has always been a record of time, the slow arc of light tracing mornings into evenings. In geology and in architecture alike, shadows have been clocks. But under a closer moon, another rhythm would be laid over these measures, the intrusion of a second hand on the dial, a second whisper of shifting light. Every night, the tides of darkness and silver brightness would mingle, rewriting how we perceive time passing in our days. Could it be that people would no longer count hours as they do, but rather in the ways their own shadows twisted and overlapped, marking memory not in clocks but in shapes drawn against the earth? This reshaped night would alter not only space, but mood. We know how deeply light affects our physiology, how moonlight has touched rituals and language in all cultures. But an enlarged moon with sharper glow would be a constant interruption, pouring silver clarity into hours that once sheltered darkness. Dreams might fracture beneath it, sleep arriving later more fragile. For without full darkness, the mind cannot always slip so far into forgetting. Would our ancestors, under such light, have slept less, woven myth instead into long restless nights, chanting stories while doubled shadows walked with them around their fires? And if so, What myths would we tell ourselves under a moon that never lets night fully close? There is also science pulsing here. Light is not neutral. It guides migrations, patterns, rhythms across ecosystems. Sea turtles that hatch in the brilliance of ordinary moonlight already mistake reflections for the path to the sea. Birds navigate by stars and lunar pull, their circuits dependent on the dimness of true night. In this imagined world, with doubled brilliance and doubled shadows, how many migrations would collapse? How many patterns of life would bend away from their ancient cues, redirected by a night no longer soft and guiding, but luminous and commanding? Perhaps the world itself would move differently, not just in tides of ocean or stone, but in the quiet migrations of instinct, forever altered by too much silver in the sky. And calm as it may appear, shadows are not empty. They are records of presence, outlines of what was. To see everything doubled, stitched again and again by twin darkness at every step, might alter how we perceive ourselves. Would we become haunted by our second selves, living each day in awareness of the doubled figure always carried behind us? Not because darkness chose it, not because the moon intended it, but because gravity bent the rules of distance and light, changing how the earth could hold the night. Maybe we would come to accept this doubling, maybe we would learn to see beauty in it, but perhaps we would always wonder if what was illuminated beside us belonged less to the body and more to the earth, remembering us differently, keeping us in its record as shadows instead of fossils, presence instead of permanence. And if even the shadows of our lives can be reshaped under the moon's closeness, then what of the dreams we dream beneath it? What of the sleep we surrender to under this vast silver gaze? Sleep has always belonged to darkness, to the gentle concealment of night, but a moon twice as near would refuse that concealment. Its mirror face would flood across oceans, across deserts, across every quiet place, until silence itself felt filled, too heavy to remain void. We would fall asleep not under darkness, but under a giant mirror reflecting the sun's forgotten light, a mirror so near we could almost see it breathing with us. Sleep would not be the same, for circadian rhythms, the clocks hidden deep in our cells, are tuned to measurements of light and shadow. We drift into slowness under the soft absence of one. We awaken with the insistence of the other. But under the silver insistence of such a nearby moon, shadows would never vanish fully. The world would glimmer at midnight as if touched by twilight, every horizon glistening with reflection. Could we ever know deep sleep under such a sky? Or would dreams itself bend, shallow and half-waking, caught between attentiveness and surrender? Perhaps memory would change with it. For sleep is where memory settles, where today dissolves into archives, where our experiences are pulled downward like sediments into stone. If the light of a giant moon were to intervene, keeping us closer to the surface of sleep, then perhaps memory would never settle as deeply, never fossilize as securely within us. Would history itself, both personal and collective, begin to blur, like fossils erased by restless tides? Would we wake with softer recall, with dreams bleeding more often into waking, until we could no longer tell which was dream and which was history? And still, there is beauty in it. To dream beneath such a face in the sky would be to dream beneath an intimacy unlike anything we have ever known. Its craters and plains would press themselves against our closed lids as if engraved there, its brightness filling even the spaces inside us with silver presence. Sleep might become a kind of communion, a nightly ritual of lying beneath a gaze too close, surrendering not to the shelter of darkness but to the constant watch of reflected fire. Maybe our ancestors, in such a world, would not seek sleep in enclosed spaces at all. Maybe they would sleep outside, gathering closer beneath the enormous eye, whispering stories as they drifted, uncertain whether they were speaking to each other or to the sky. Science, quiet as it is, offers traces of this. We know that moonlight influences cycles of melatonin, the hormone that ascribes drowsiness to the body. We know wild animals shift their behavior as phases turn. A moon closer, larger, more persistent, would amplify those influences. Herds shifting their migrations by too much light, predators circling more cautiously on nights too luminous, nocturnal species losing their shadowed shelters. An entire layer of the biosphere, what we now call the night world, would be reshaped under the mirror's glare. And we, too, as part of that world, would be reshaped with it, our sleep, our dreaming, our memory carved anew. Yet dreams are not measured only in hormones and cycles. They are the metaphors we surrender to willingly, the visions that remind us that life is fluid, that self is not as fixed as daylight insists. Under such a face in the sky, filling the horizon with its magnified echoes of ancient impacts, would our dreams change tone? Would they be heavier, etched with shadows sharper than imagination, or would they be lighter, more luminous, filled with the silver rivers spilling across the surface of the moon itself? Could we even say our dreams would be our own, or would they belong partly to the earth and partly to its companion, shaped together as surely as tides shape the shore? Perhaps this is the essence of imagining life under a giant mirror, that sleep becomes less personal, less private, and more shared. Not yours, not mine, but ours. All of us, together beneath its brightness. The idea that dreaming could become collective, a kind of unconscious tide moving through humanity at once, pressed subtly by the gaze above. Not because the moon intends it, not because it chooses to, but because gravity pulls at all things, even the shadows of minds drifting in the dark. And if even sleep itself could be transformed under such brightness, if dreams become communal tides beneath an enormous mirror, then what would the seas be beneath it? What coastlines would remain in a world where oceans themselves lean harder into the sky? Oceans, already restless, would roar and retreat with new intensity under the nearness of such a moon. Each tide, instead of being the gentle breathing we know, would rise like an upheaval, lifting coastlines higher, then dragging them back with a violence so patient it is disguised as rhythm. To us, it would feel like endless repetition. To the earth, it would be rewriting. Shorelines, which we mistake for permanence, would lose that illusion. Beaches would vanish and return in cycles too rapid for continuity. Deltas carried by rivers for thousands of years would dissolve in a handful of centuries, their veins carved over again like notes erased and redrawn upon the same page. Estuaries would elongate, then collapse, lagoons filling and emptying with such speed that memory of their shapes would never settle long enough to be trusted. The geography of Earth, which now gives us the comfort of maps, would instead become a shifting manuscript of water, coastlines retreating faster than ink drying on paper. Continents themselves would groan under the pressure, for the moon's doubled pull would accelerate erosion. The cliffs fractured, silt thickened, headlands pulled grain by grain toward the deep. The very identity of land would blur, as stone surrendered earlier than it might have, its endurance tested not by millions of years, but by a few hundred. What mountains the seas could not swallow, the rains would gnaw away, guided by the enhanced tides that fed storms unceasing. We imagine continents as ancient, as solid, as proud in their staying. But under such cycles they would learn impermanence, just as surely as shells become sand. The memory of coastlines, too, would grow fragile and fleeting. Villages built by waters would not pass into quaint ruin, but be consumed completely, their stones carried outward, their traces dissolved in chemical silence. Even fossils would be fewer here, unable to linger in the intertidal chaos. Life that lived where sea and land embraced would rarely leave its echo. Instead, its story would be erased almost as soon as told. Perhaps only in the deep ocean sediments, far away from shoreline turbulence, would slower stories still be written, layers of plankton, of shells, of slow rain from the surface falling to the abyss. In them, a quieter memory might endure, if only to remind us that all silence hides somewhere, even when the surface refuses peace. Every coastline becomes a threshold between forgetting and remembering. In this rewritten world, that threshold tilts further toward forgetting. Waves take stone, storms take homes, rivers are erased at their mouths. And could it be that, under such circumstances, our concept of home would change? Perhaps people would no longer build monuments by the sea, no longer write their histories on fragile shores, just as fossils no longer write in unstable sediments. Could an entire civilization turn inland, not out of choice but out of necessity, learning not to trust water's edge? Maybe not. Yet the moon's pull would insist on this lesson, that what is near will not wait, and what is fragile will dissolve. And still, There is awe in such flexing impermanence. For the earth itself would display its dynamism more vividly than ever before. Time, which usually hides behind slowness, would show its speed. Land itself would feel like an actor performing impermanence openly, acknowledging that all worlds, whether continents or memory, exist only as moments caught between creation and decay. The seas, rewritten again and again, would remind us of entropy, of how every shape, no matter how grand, is subject to dissolution. Not because the world expires, but because it changes. Not because memory fails, but because memory refuses to stay still. And so, as oceans roar louder, and coastlines slip more quickly into disappearance, we ask ourselves, if land itself yields so easily, what of the cliffs of time, where whole ages are carved not in sand but in stone? If shorelines cannot remain, can cliffs become the true keepers of memory? For cliffs, unlike beaches, do not pretend to be soft. They stand, resisting. They wait, they face the sea, and they hold stories within themselves, pressed layer by layer across millions of years. In their faces we read the chapters of time, the archives of ancient climates, the remnants of lives long dissolved elsewhere yet preserved here in the compressed silence of rock. But under a closer moon, even cliffs cannot wait forever. For gravity and tide together dictate the rhythm of their decay, and geology itself would become quicker, less patient. Cliffs speak slowly now. They speak in millennia, in the careful handwriting of fossils resting between beds of limestone, in the fine lines of clay carved by rising oceans, then erased by their retreat. They are endurance, the illusion of steadiness in a world that rarely offers it. But with the moon drawing nearer, tides crash harder against their base. Erosion strikes deeper, storms slice into their layers more repeatedly, and the writing within them, still legible but trembling, begins to blur with urgency. What once took 10,000 years to collapse might break in a few centuries. Geology, that slow and deliberate keeper of centuries, begins to stutter, accelerating into a language we can almost hear within our own lifetimes. And yet, in the fragments that fall, there is still story. Shattered cliffs tumble into the sea not in silence but in testimony. Fossils dislodged, long buried, spill into the light again. Ridges cut open reveal sudden exposures of epochs layered one upon another. Tropical seas that were once deserts, forests entombed in ash, traces of ice stretched across plains no longer frozen. A moon closer does not only erase. Sometimes it disrupts enough to reveal, to peel open pages of stone earlier than we might otherwise find them. Entropy speaks loudly not only in destruction but in revelation, in the reminder that what we believe to be finished is forever in process. What if we imagined cliffs not as final monuments, but as voices mid-sentence, paused, struck, and reshaped by every tide? Could we imagine them as memory not fixed but breathing, inhaling each time layers are pressed by new sediments, exhaling each time pieces fall to surf? In this rhythm, cliffs are no longer silent guardians but participants in the constant rewriting of Earth's story. Perhaps permanence was never their message. Perhaps their message was only endurance through change. Science tells us that acceleration leaves records of its own. Faster erosion deposits thicker sediments in new places. Isotopes locked in remaining layers carry signals, ratios of oxygen that tell the warmth of an ancient sea, concentrations of carbon that whisper of forest die-offs or blooms of life. Even if acceleration blurs, it does not erase all. It leaves behind clues written differently, not in words but in distributions, in chemistry, in mixtures of dust and mineral. But would we, peering back someday, know how to read them correctly? Or would acceleration disguise the age of things, compressing millennia into spans so short they confuse us, as though the Earth's handwriting had suddenly rushed into illegibility? And still, cliffs are metaphors as much as geology. They remind us of standing at thresholds, looking both into the future and backward into eons layered beneath us. To see time carved in cliffs is to see ourselves layered too. Our memories stacked, our silences archived, our identities pressed into sediment waiting to erode. If cliffs rewrite themselves faster in a world of nearer tides, maybe we too would rewrite ourselves faster. Could it be that human cultures, like cliffs, would shed their outer layers more urgently, never holding still long enough to think of permanence? Would we become less defined by what we keep and more defined by what we let go? Maybe, maybe not. And so we stand by the edge and watch. The cliffs stretch tall. They lean over seas that roar more often, and each movement of water peels back another line of stone. Faster, closer, louder. The earth writes in its cliffs not permanence but acceleration. Each fall of rock is a reminder we cannot hold the illusion of stillness, because even stone carries the pulse of the moon. And if cliffs themselves, once the longest sentences of earth, can learn to speak in pages torn loose too soon, what then of the fragile web of species clinging to those coasts, whose lives depend not on permanence but on the changing rhythm itself? Life along the shore has always been precarious, drawn to the edge where water meets land, where danger walks close beside nourishment. But with the moon twice as near, the rhythms upon which these creatures rely would shift too quickly, too violently, too often. Tidal, those jewel-like worlds tucked between rocks, would face constant upheaval. Where once starfish, anemones, and mussels adjusted to modest tides, now the pools would rise and vanish, refilled beyond recognition, drained and refilled again until delicate balances dissolved. Creatures built to endure pause and return would instead face erasure. Washed too far out to sea, left too exposed in air, their cycles shortened before memory could carry them forward. Perhaps new life would adapt, quick breeding, quick changing, born to thrive in instability. But old forms would falter, their lineage broken not by extinction alone, but by an erosion of rhythm. In estuaries, where the mingling of river and saltwater once nurtured entire nurseries of life, the moon's doubled grip would redraw the rules. Fresh water would be swallowed further upstream with each flood, while salt carved its way inland, changing chemistry in sudden, jarring beats. Species that had lived in tolerances measured by shades, slight gradients of salinity, would find those gradients suddenly torn open, swinging wildly. Some fish may lose their breeding grounds, unable to read the cues. Marsh plants might fail, their roots drowned or scorched in unpredictable sequence. These border zones, once safe refuges in the great cycle of life, would instead become testing grounds of survival, stripping away what cannot bend. Reefs, too, would endure strange punishment under swells that refused calm. Coral, already fragile beneath warming seas and acidifying currents, would be pounded more ruthlessly by tides. Symbiotic relationships between coral and algae, fish and coral, reef and current, would unravel under constant disruption. For reefs depend not only on growth but on a degree of stillness, a chance for structures to harden, for skeletons of generations to fuse. In a world where tides are restless mountains, that stillness rarely comes. Entire reef systems, instead of growing into cathedrals of life, might falter, cracked or dissolved into carbonate sands faster than their builders can rebuild them. And yet, in the churning debris, new habitats might occasionally emerge, temporary shelters of rubble, where other life could find a foothold. Not because the sea is merciful, but because life insists on filling even the briefest opportunity with breath. Ecosystems, once slow theaters of rise and fall, would live on narrower stages. Time compresses when the environment accelerates and generations adapt or vanish, under cycles racing faster than evolution expects. In such a world, perhaps extinction itself would feel less final, less unusual, simply part of a normal rhythm of turnover. Yet extinction is not only the loss of creatures but of relationships, the silencing of connections woven delicately across food chains, behaviors, migrations. Entire communities would unravel at once, leaving landscapes blank for something new to take hold. Science whispers this truth in its own patience. We know, in isotope trails within shells, how species once endured sudden climate jolts, how some adapted within centuries, and others disappeared outright. We know fossils preserve both flourishing and collapse, the records of ecosystems that rose high only to fracture. A moon nearer would accelerate such cycles. Entire phases of civilization within the natural world might come and go like tidal appearing only briefly before dissolving. Could it be that life itself would become more fleeting beneath a closer moon, less monumental, more improvisational? Not because life is weak, but because everything is bound more tightly to the tempo of the tides. And yet, creatures would still try. We would still try. The web of life, though fragile, is never empty, always weaving with what remains. Perhaps, instead of continuity, the new beauty of Earth would be its constant reinvention. Species appearing, vanishing, re-emerging in new forms across cycles that leave little time for stillness. Life would no longer be written in slow murals upon reefs and shores, but in fast-changing sketches across unstable landscapes. Maybe that, too, is a form of endurance. Maybe adaptation itself is the true permanence. But if the fragile web of species is so reshaped, so hurried, so unsettled beneath the pull of the nearer moon, then what does it mean for us, humility bound to coastlines, homes built in harbors, stories sung at water's edge? What would become of human dwelling when the sea itself growls nearer with every cycle? When even the fragile certainties we hold must be surrendered to tides stronger than memory? What becomes of our dwellings under tides that no longer whisper, but roar like mountains rising twice a day? We imagine cities enduring the colossal pull, but can they endure? Could harbors, with their carved walls and sheltered piers, still hold vessels against such force? Or would they fall, brick by brick, their stones scattered not by centuries of wear, but by the rhythm of a tide too strong for memory to anchor? Perhaps we would try. Humanity has always built against water, driving pylons deep into mud, stacking stones along shorelines, building walls to speak the word stay. But staying becomes fragile here. Bridges stretched across estuaries might sway under the endless pulse, foundations weakened before their design has aged. Streets designed for dry ground would drown and reappear in endless cycles, cities existing partly in memory, partly in water. Could it be that our modern constructs, heavy with steel and concrete, would dissolve faster than the simple, shifting dwellings of our ancient ancestors? Not because they lack strength, but because they refuse to yield. Maybe permanence, in a nearer-moon world, would not belong to walls but to movement itself. So perhaps cultures would begin to shape themselves around retreat. Not conquest of the sea, not defiance of its constant erasure, but a life lived further inland, always stepping back with each new century of rising tides. Towns would be built with the knowledge that they are temporary, stories told with the understanding they will be submerged. Could villages become like migrating species, drifting, not fixed in place but woven into the landscapes of rivers and hills away from the reach of tides? Civilizations may grow not beside the ocean as we know them now, but in the sheltered heartlands, far from salt, far from the pounding pull of the altered moon. And yet, even as we imagine this retreat, can we imagine a humanity that abandons the sea completely? Our oldest stories are water stories. Our trade routes, our myths, our sense of exploration, they all begin with the tide. Could we ever resolve to live far from it? Or would we return again and again, trying once more to withstand its hunger, always failing, always returning? Perhaps this is the cycle: we build, we lose, we return. Not because the sea welcomes us, but because we cannot resist its call. The evidence of these attempts might be found in the future as technofossils, traces of human buildings scattered in sediment. Concrete crumbled into pebbles, glass melted into sand, rusted steel collapsing into stains within the soil. Archaeologists, if any remain, would uncover harbors where no sea rests today, bridges broken in valleys now dry, remnants of retreat layered inland, each one a step further from the coast. History's handwriting shifts here. Peoples archived not in one place but in a series of vanishings, each telling the same story in different terrain. We built near the sea reminded us we cannot hold it, and we faded back. Science supports this rhythm. Already isotopes in old coral and ancient deltas reveal stories of shifting shorelines, of storms and surges swallowing towns left nameless. Already we see ruins beneath the Mediterranean, relics submerged in Asia, drowned cities hidden by silt. A moon nearer would scatter such stories in abundance, multiplying the evidence of retreat. Humanity's memory would exist not in monuments that endure, but in ruins repeating patterns of self-erasure carved into the map again and again. And so, perhaps the idea of dwelling itself would change. Home would no longer be stone and permanence, but movement, the ability to carry culture rather than anchor it. Songs instead of monuments, myths instead of lasting walls. Not because stone is weak, but because the tides are stronger. Maybe what survives most of all are not the buildings but the stories spoken each time we begin again. Stories that remember the hunger of the sea. Stories that whisper, we tried, we lost, we still live. And yet, if our dwellings themselves dissolve, if culture must migrate inland again and again, what then of the rivers that carry us there? Could their destinies remain steady? Or would they too be rewritten beneath the swollen gravity of a nearer moon? For rivers, too, are not immune to the moon's pull. They are arteries of the land, drawn always to the sea, sculpting their courses against stone, collecting memory in silt. But when the coastlines shift and the tides roar with twice their strength, even the long patience of rivers is broken. Their mouths become unstable, their paths undone, their destinies rewritten by a force larger than their own. Deltas, once great keepers of memory, would be among the first to suffer. These fragile fans of sediment, built grain by grain over thousands of years, would be dismantled quickly by rising surges. Channels that once wandered gently into the ocean would collapse, drowned beneath stronger tides or carved apart by storms that dig deeper with each season. The Nile, the Mississippi, the Ganges. All these rivers that have carried civilizations on their backs would find their endings torn, their sediments scattered further into the abyss before they can settle into permanence. What was once a final resting place for history becomes instead a place of unraveling. The science whispers behind this poetry. Rivers are record keepers. Within their sediments are isotopes that mark climates, particles of pollen that echo vanished forests, fragments of bone and charcoal that speak of flood and fire. But a closer moon would smudge this writing, carrying the record too far, scattering pieces where connection cannot be drawn. What story can be told when the pages of the archive are carried away before they are bound together? Could it be that the story of rivers themselves becomes unreadable, their endings erased as though time had forgotten to look back? And still, rivers would try to reclaim themselves. Some might press harder inland, carving new paths as seas invaded. Others might abandon their familiar mouths and find new places to meet the ocean. Entire landscapes would grow restless as waters rearranged themselves. Valleys deepening, canyons widening, estuaries transforming into lagoons and back again. Each shift would be both destructive and creative, erasing one form while suggesting the outline of another. Entropy does not simply devour. It draws and redraws, blurring permanence into transition. For those who live beside rivers, it would feel like betrayal. Fields once nourished by silts would suddenly drown in salt. Villages on dependable banks would find the river abandoning them, its allegiance cut short by tides too strong to resist. Perhaps we would follow the water inland, just as surely as we follow it to sea, carrying our settlements like seeds scattered by its wandering. We would learn once more what earlier peoples always knew. A river is not a line but a living body, subject to moods, not bound by maps. And in this rearrangement, memory itself begins to dissolve. For rivers have long been metaphors of remembrance. We speak of them as timeless, as inevitable as flow itself. But in a nearer moon world, even flow betrays us. Continuity fractures into uncertainty. What if we could no longer rely on water carrying stories downstream? What if every spring melt scattered its record too widely for any archive to hold? Is it possible that memory itself becomes like water, always moving, never kept, dissolving where fresh meets salt? And yet, within this dissolution lies wonder. The very erasure of deltas could scatter material into the deep ocean, where sediments slowly compress, layer by layer, into stone records future geologists might one day find. Perhaps memory does not vanish. It only hides in deeper archives, carried far beyond our view. Maybe what feels like loss on the shore is survival further out, where silence keeps it longer. So, the rivers reshape, the deltas dismantle, the estuaries wash and renew. They lose their old paths, but in doing so, they find new destinies. They remind us that nothing moves alone. Not land, not life, not memory. Everything moves to the moon's pull, Everything is rewritten by gravity's guidance. And if even rivers, those patient carvers of stone and song, alter course beneath a swollen tide, then what of us? Our identities, our histories, our sense of self, tugged to by gravity's insistence? Could the moon, in drawing our waters, be drawing our memories closer as well? The moon shapes not only oceans and stone but everything bound to earth, and gravity is no mere force. It is memory made physical, a thread that keeps our planet and our past held together. When the moon draws nearer, the thread tightens. The pull grows heavier. And suddenly, we are asked to wonder, how much of who we are depends on this delicate balance between closeness and distance? In the physical world, gravity bends not just the sea but time itself. Nearer masses deepen the curve of space, slowing clocks minutely, imperceptibly, but altering them all the same. If the moon were closer, we too would live closer to that subtle distortion, our minutes drawn longer, our sense of time pulled into new shapes. Could the very rhythm of memory, which relies on time to separate present from past, stretch differently beneath the moon's gaze? Perhaps our recollections would gather more heavily, burdened by gravity's nearness, harder to release. Perhaps forgetting would not feel so light. Memory already behaves like a tide. It comes, it goes, it rises each time we revisit an event. It ebbs when forgotten spaces settle in. Some memories fossilize into permanence, like shells hardened in chalk beds, their shapes lasting through years. Others dissolve like salt, washed away before we realize they were ever there. If the moon doubled its hand upon us, could memory shift its balance? Would the deep grooves of trauma and joy grow deeper still, carved more insistently because the very cycles of our bodies, our sleep, our physiology, our tides of thought were heavier in their rhythm? Or would memories become brittle, breaking when pulled too tightly in opposite directions, fragile edges eroded just as surely as coastlines? It is not only the personal but the collective. Cultures remember through ritual, through calendars, through monuments built to endure. And yet, under a nearer moon, time itself spirals faster toward erasure. Monuments collapse sooner beneath ceaseless tides. Calendars lose their rhythm beneath wilder seasons. Collective history becomes scattered, rewritten not by choice but by altered physics. Entire epochs might vanish into entropy with little trace, civilizations drowning before their stories have the chance to enter stone. Could our past, then, grow heavier with loss, holding not only what we recall but also what we know was never preserved? The sciences of deep time already teach us silence. Rock layers that should tell chapters instead fall mute, their sediments recycled into magma by subduction. Fossils that could have spoken dissolve before preservation. The isotope trails of forgotten climates fade into unreadability, leaving only puzzles, ambiguities, half-whispered hints of ancient ages. But in a closer moon world, that silence grows louder. More pages are torn before written. More epochs withdraw before we can recall them. The archive of Earth is rewritten not as continuity but as absence. In this way, gravity itself becomes a metaphor. The nearer the moon, the heavier our past becomes. Not with clarity, but with gaps, with unspeakable silence gathering where memory should have been. And what of identity? If memory is not only what we keep but what we lose, then who we are may change with every alteration of gravity's pull. Perhaps identity itself requires distance as much as it requires closeness. Too distant, and nothing anchors us, nothing is remembered. Too close, and nothing is lost. Nothing can breathe away into silence. Memory must circulate like the tides, moving in and out, returning and retreating. Is it possible that a moon pushing closer would pin us too tightly to remembrance, making the past feel heavier than the present? Or perhaps the opposite, pulling our present away too swiftly, scattering us into fragments of half-formed recollection. Not because gravity chooses this, not because the moon intends it, but because nearness alters balance, and balance alters everything we experience. Time, memory, identity. Maybe who we are is not fixed in ourselves at all, but an echo stretched between earth and moon, written in each rise of tide, each lengthening day. Maybe we are nothing more than memory made material, held briefly in a balance between closeness and distance. And yet, if the moon's grip shapes even memory, binding us in its pull, then what else beats in its rhythm? Could it be that beneath the surface, in the molten body of Earth itself, another pulse is felt? A planetary heartbeat, sinking stone and sea, time and self, all to the cadence of a closer companion? In this imagined world, Earth is not only touched by the moon but entrained, locked into resonance. Twice the closeness means twice the pulse, twice the breath. The planet itself seems to throb, an immense rhythm felt not in moments but in the lengthening of days, the motion of oceans, the flexing of its hidden bones. Every sphere, every body in space vibrates, pulled as much as it pulls. Earth sways to its moon's rhythm as much as the moon sways to Earth's. Even now, tidal forces shift the seafloors, lifting and pressing with each orbit, subtle yet constant. With the moon nearer, these rhythms intensify, becoming not whispers but pulses, shaping every layer of our planet. Mountains on the ocean floor rise imperceptibly higher as water presses them. Crusts expand and contract like breathing lungs. Magma stirs in mantles that have never been still. It is as if Earth itself has a heartbeat, and the moon closer means that heartbeat runs stronger, heavier, more insistent beneath our feet. This heartbeat is not made of blood but of stone and molten fire. Subduction zones grow more restless under shifting weight, pulling entire slabs of crust downward into the deep. Earthquakes align their slips more tightly with lunar cycles, tremors echoing like a drum through the body of continents. Volcanoes crack open sooner, as if their exhalations are demanded by the rhythm above. Even layers of sediments feel the cadence, compressed differently, carrying within their burial an accelerated tempo, a geological music we may not yet know how to hear. Could it be possible that Earth itself keeps time not by its spin alone, but by the nearness of its moon, heart beating in resonance with an orbit? And still, we must ask, what does it mean for us to live upon a world whose very pulse is altered? Perhaps we, too, are entrained by it. After all, our bodies are water, our cells dependent on balance, on tides of chemistry. Human life grew in the cradle of cycles, tuned itself to seasons and days, the push and pull of rhythms larger than thought. If Earth's pulse beats differently under a nearer moon, maybe our hearts carry echoes of it. Faster, slower, subtly shifted. Could identity itself not only rest in memory but in resonance, in how our very atoms are tuned to the breath of the world? Philosophy and science blend here. Entropy marches forward, yes, but entropy has pulse as well. Disorder does not arrive in silence. It has a texture, a frequency, an undertone humming beneath the chaos. The closer moon quickens these murmurs, shortens periods of waiting, compresses epochs into nearer intervals. To us, it becomes a strange paradox. Time feels slower in memory yet faster in reality. Things endure less yet feel heavier. Perhaps this is what it means to live under a stronger planetary heartbeat. A constant awareness of the temporary, each moment vibrating with significance, each silence holding the resonance of something on the brink of change. Maybe this is why ancient peoples worshipped the rhythm of the moon, why tides and cycles became their calendars. Perhaps, deep within, they felt what we cannot easily measure, that we walk upon a living body tuned to something larger than itself. That even stone has a pulse if we listen slowly enough. And maybe, if the moon were doubled nearer, that pulse would no longer be hidden. Maybe we would feel it in our souls at night, a trembling beneath the quiet ground, a resonance that belongs as much to the sky as to the earth. And yet, if Earth itself beats more heavily under such resonance, if even mountains and seas follow the double tempo of a planetary heartbeat, what then of rotation? What then of the length of days, the dance of light and shadow that governs how civilizations measure their lives? Could the pull of the nearer moon change even the spin of time itself? For a nearer moon does not only shape tides and cliffs, it pulls at Earth's very spin, slowing it as though holding the planet by its edges. Day by day, imperceptibly, the world drags its feet. The spin lengthens. Time once steady, bends. Already, even with the moon at its current distance, Earth's rotation slows, a fraction of a second stolen each year, lengthening days ever so slightly. In deep time, we know this truth from evidence written in stone, from coral fossils whose growth bands reveal a past when days were shorter, when years carried more rotations. The moon has always been tugging, always whispering a slower rhythm. Twice as close, its hand would be stronger. The lengthening of days would come faster. Nights would arrive later, mornings linger longer, the familiar cadence of time itself shifting beneath us. For us, time is not only astronomical, it is cultural. We live by days, by weeks, by calendars that imagine permanence in the turning of the earth. But a nearer moon would scatter such patterns. Calendars would drift out of step, months no longer aligning with seasons, years no longer feeling as they once did. History itself would bend, shaped by a rhythm foreign to us now. Imagine civilizations rising beneath longer days, where the heat of the sun lingers longer upon fields. Crops burn or flourish under these new conditions, societies adapt or dissolve. Even the stories they tell, the myths of gods and cycles, would bend toward this new pace. Could it be that under such an altered moon, human identity itself would grow different, molded less by the sun than by the slowing touch of a nearby companion? Geology records such transformations with patience. Strata preserve isotope trails of climates stretched by orbital shifts. Layered sediments encode drought or flood influenced by lengthening rhythms. If the moon were nearer, those shifting isotopes would stack more quickly, archives of acceleration pressed into every band of rock. Millennia later, future geologists might read them as frantic tempo changes, abrupt accelerations of time's handwriting. Entire epochs would not linger as they do now. They would tilt into one another, pages turning before they've settled. A closer moon might fold the script of deep time into an unfamiliar meter, history rewritten not as patience but as urgency. And still, there is a gentleness here. For though rotation slows, there is no sudden tearing. The dance between Earth and Moon is not abrupt. It is graceful, a slowing like the exhale that follows breath. Perhaps this is what makes it a dance. Two bodies circling, drawing each other nearer and farther in slow spirals, one giving spin, the other gaining distance. In our imagined Earth with its closer moon, the slowing would be swifter, noticeable not in years, but in cultural memory. Generations would remark that seasons stretch strangely, that shadows linger too long upon the ground. Perhaps myths would tell of a sun that refuses to rest, or a night reluctant to return. There is something humbling in this recognition, that time itself is not fixed, not an eternal law, but a shifting rhythm dictated by gravity and spin. We are not simply moving through days. Days themselves are moving beneath us, stretching, reshaping, pulling away from their past length. Identity, memory, history, everything we count upon time to frame, becomes unstable the moment we realize the clock itself is being rewritten by forces much older than us. And maybe not. Perhaps we would adapt easily, our cultures resetting calendars, our crops bending to new patterns of light. Perhaps humanity's gift is not resisting rhythm but learning to hear it differently. Still, the question lingers quietly. Who are we if days themselves change? What happens to memory when its most faithful measure, the cycle of sunlight and darkness, slips into another key? And if even the spin of Earth, its very heartbeat of time, can be slowed by the insistence of the moon's pull, then what of those who came before us? Ancient civilizations who looked upward and saw this same face, perhaps larger, perhaps closer, shaping not only their skies but their myths as well. Would they have thrived beneath its brightness, or faltered under its weight? Would their cities have risen confidently at the edge of silver seas, or would they have learned to step back, to bow to waters that erased their monuments almost as quickly as they were built? The image is haunting. Imagine temples rising not just toward the sun but toward the moon itself, their walls carved with craters and shadowed landscapes copied from above, imitating the luminous detail visible to naked eyes. Even without telescopes, no imagination would be required. The nearer moon would reveal its mountains and valleys directly. Priests may have traced rituals to the cycles not only of light but of tides, believing that creation and destruction lived in the breathing of the oceans. Entire religions could have formed not around permanence but around impermanence. The understanding that seas claim and release, in rhythms that no human hand could tame. Yet myths are born not only from reverence but from survival. Under higher tides, entire villages might have been swept away in storms generations apart yet certain in return. Memories of these vanishings, handed down through stories, would suffuse their beliefs. The moon might not have been only a goddess of beauty but a god of hunger, a constant reminder of the fragility of human dwelling. Could it be that our oldest myths of floods, of submerged kingdoms, of seas swallowing proud cities, might trace not to distant imagination but to lived experience, echoes of civilizations built by silver seas too close to hold still? The earth would have kept record of them, too. In submerged ruins, in silted walls, buried roads, now memories within estuaries. Archaeologists might one day uncover shards of pottery layered deep within storm sediments, artifacts preserved not in dry caves or deserts but beneath tidal sands. Yet, just as fossils dissolve under two restless waves, many of these records might be lost forever, a collective erasure of our species' early attempts at durability. Soil chemistry might carry faint isotope markers of hearth fires quenched by salt, traces of agriculture rewritten by water where no shoreline could remain steady long enough to take root. History, blurred as deeply as geology itself, would flicker between what existed and what we can never recover. Still, it is possible that some cultures would embrace ephemerality. Where permanence falters, mobility grows sacred. Perhaps great traveling societies would emerge, bound not to soil but to rhythm, moving inland and seaward with every generational tide. Their stories would preserve knowledge in language, in song, in memory carried on breath instead of stone. This, too, would be survival, recognizing that to endure is not always to resist but to yield. And in their myths, the moon might not simply be feared, nor adored, but understood as the partner shaping their world, both companion and destroyer. It is humbling to consider that myth and geology may have been less separate here, less divided between faith and science. When tides consume the shoreline every day like mountains rising and falling, there is no distinction between natural process and divine presence. The earth itself becomes mythic, the moon a teacher written across the sky. Could it be that under such a world, humanity's imagination of gods would look not to abstractions unseen, but directly to the luminous mirror above? That worship itself would be geology, the cracks of stone and the pulling of tides presented as a liturgy larger than human life? And perhaps those civilizations would have passed more quickly into silence. Their ruins returned to salt, their libraries floating as scattered artifacts, their calendars lost beneath the rewriting of rivers and seasons. Yet even in erasure, memory persists. Stories of floods remain in myth, whispers of vanished islands thread through language. Maybe what we call legend is the remnant of truth, surviving when stone cannot survive, proving that even in forgetting, fragments of memory echo. So we wonder, did ancient humanity live under a moon closer than ours today? Or is this a dream we only imagine? Would mythology itself be different if permanence was never promised? If the pulse of tides was stronger, closer, more insistent? We cannot know. What is certain is that myth and geology alike tell us we are shaped from forces far beyond ourselves. And yet, if civilizations themselves can vanish so easily into oceans and silence, what traces of our modern world might endure when tides rise again? Could it be that the future will find only fragments, technofossils and ruins sifted from storm beds, unreadable records beneath layers of salt and entropy? Ancient ruins crumble into silt, their stories carried away in fragments too delicate to withstand erosion. But our age has left behind new kinds of matter, stranger, more durable, more resistant to forgetting. Cities drowned by unforgiving seas would not dissolve entirely. They would leave behind technofossils, the unnatural companions of geology. Plastic, steel, glass, and concrete, pressed into sediment where once only shells and bones belonged. Imagine a harbor swallowed whole by rising tides. Skyscrapers softened into reefs, highways consumed by waves, bridges snapped and scattered by salt. Concrete, shredded into fine particles, filters slowly into the seabed. Glass shatters, reshaping itself into powder indistinguishable from sand. Plastics, though resist, floating for years before being buried by silt, compressed eventually into strange rocks melded with shells, volcanic ash, coral, and chemical residue. These will be the fossils of our present. These will speak in silence when our narratives are gone. In deep time, technofossils would whisper differently than ammonites or trilobites or trees. They would not reveal ecosystems or tell of natural climates, but of artifice, of invention, of a species that turned stone into towers, deep ancient carbon into polymer. What could be inferred from their residue? Perhaps that a civilization once lived dense along the coasts, but their cities never endured. Their foundations always surrendered to the ocean. Perhaps future minds, if any rise to study, would mistake our technofossils for natural forms, plastic nodules mistaken for resin, alloys mistaken for mineral veins. Or perhaps it would be clear. These were the remnants of beings who left behind materials geology itself never would have crafted. Entropy plays its quiet hand here, too. Steel corrodes. Electronics dissolve. Layers of mercury, lead, cesium, carbon isotopes, all subtle trails pressed into ice and rock, will become geological signatures, strange fingerprints revealing our presence long after memory has faded. Not because we chose to be remembered, but because the matter we make defies erasure, surviving longer than languages, longer than stone records carved deliberately. Could it be that our greatest monument is unintentional, the scattered legacy of polymers and alloys sleeping beneath tides? Perhaps, perhaps not. But what is certain is that traces of us will embed themselves in sediments, storytelling not in words but in chemistry. In science, these evidences already exist. Farmers' dust layered into soils, microplastics woven into marine sediments, concrete fragments sinking into coastal trenches, carbon isotopes rising through atmospheric cycles, captured now in ice that will remain long after our books dissolve. These are the beginnings of technofossils, seeds of our material memory already pressing themselves into Earth's archive. When the moon grows closer and tides grow wilder, these traces will scatter faster, sinking deeper, archived more forcefully by relentless waters. And yet, there is quiet melancholy in this. For even as our artifacts mark presence, the lives that shaped them vanish. No poetry remains embedded in a piece of plastic hardened into rock. No dream asleep inside strands of steel. They are shells of us, stripped of all story, reduced only to evidence. Is it possible memory itself becomes inverted here, our technologies surviving while our myths dissolve, our physical traces lasting longer than the meanings tied to them? What then does it mean to endure, if we endure namelessly, through matter alone? Perhaps, though, there is beauty in recognizing that we, too, become part of geology, that our story becomes sediment. We join the long procession of beings layered into cliffs, into ocean floors, into silent strata. Not because we are exceptional, not because we are eternal, but because the earth remembers by forgetting, pressing all into stone eventually, each in its own time, each in its own silence. And as technofossils drift into the archives of drowned coastlines, as plastic and steel merge with shells and sand, we might wonder, if this is how matter remembers us, how else might the sea record our rhythm? For if the tides can bury us, can erase us, can archive us unknowingly, perhaps they can also breathe us back, in oceans whose pulse becomes indistinguishable from our own breath. For tides do not only swallow, they give cadence. They breathe in and out with a constancy we cannot escape, and even in erasure they provide a pulse. The ocean's pulse, steady beneath the gaze of the nearer moon, seeps into us until it is mirrored in the rise and fall of our own breath. We may not notice it, yet the rhythm of water has always shaped us. Waves measure time differently than clocks. They are slower, deeper, more patient, more faithful. Stand on a shore and you fall inward to their pattern without trying. Breathe with the sea, and suddenly you align with something vast, something ancient. Could it be that before machines calibrated our minutes, before calendars weighed our years, we belonged to this greater rhythm, the inhalation of tides, the exhalation of silence? Perhaps inside us the memory remains. Under a moon twice as close, that rhythm would quicken and intensify. Tides rising higher, retreating further, their pull louder, their silence longer. Human life, even in small gestures, might begin to mirror these heaves. Breath might slow unconsciously, sinking not to our own body alone but to the swell of nearby waters. Rituals, prayers, meditations, music, would bend to this rhythm as if instructed by gravity itself. Drums might echo the timing of waves. Chants might carry the pace of tidal retreat. Worship would become not only directed at the moon above, but at its writing in us, the quiet reminder that our bodies are fluid continuations of the sea. Science whispers the same truth in subtler ways. Our blood, like seawater, carries the memory of salt long after our ancestors stepped onto dry land. Our cells expand and contract in cycles reminiscent of tides. Hormones rise and fall with timing tied faintly, still, to lunar cycles. Sleep patterns shift across the phases of the moon, melatonin rising and falling not because of sunlight alone, but because of the silver brightness spilling upon our world. It is almost as if the moon has been scripting our physiology all along, inscribing its poetry into our most private circulations. A nearer moon would only strengthen its handwriting. And what might that mean for memory, for identity? Perhaps our sense of self, already fluid, would become more tidal, washed in, washed out, never fixed but endlessly rewritten. Just as coastlines shift under water's persistence, our mental landscapes might shift too, guided by these gravitational rhythms. Could it be that our lives would not feel linear, as stories we try to hold straight, but circular? Forever coiling, forever returning, full of comings and goings, like tidewater folding into sand? Perhaps even our perception of time itself would grow less precise, more embodied in cycles, more immersed in flow. Rituals of antiquity hint at this possibility. Stone circles aligned not only to the sun but to lunar risings. Myths of fertility bound to lunar cycles. Ceremonies of entry and departure timed to the fullness of reflected silver in the night sky. These may not have been symbolic alone. They may have been entrainments, ways humans synchronize themselves with rhythms larger than themselves. In a world where the moon loomed larger still, such rituals would carry even stronger necessity. They would not only be remembrance, but survival. A way of keeping our breath steady enough to coexist with waters that never stopped moving. And in this recognition, humility blossoms. The pulse of the ocean is not lesser than ours, it is ours only magnified. Our breath is the tide in miniature. Chest rising with the pull of indrawn air, collapsing with the retreat. We are mirrors of water, echoes of moonlight, fragments of the same rhythm written across scales of existence. Not because we wish it, not because we design it, but because gravity pulls every body, every mind into the same unwritten music. Perhaps this is the poetry of the moon. Not that it is distant, but that we are never truly apart from it. Perhaps its gift is not only light or tides or calendars, but rhythm itself. The understanding that to live is to move in and out, to inhale and exhale, to hold and release. And yet, if breath itself can become tidal, if memory can move with oceans and physiology can sing with gravity, what then happens to the places forgotten when seas rewrite them? Those ghost coasts abandoned to the water, where silence and erosion speak louder than us. For as tides grow higher and storms strike with growing cadence, the most vulnerable stories are those written at the shore. Harbors once filled with masts, voices, and markets now crumble beneath silt. Seawalls collapse, their foundations softened grain by grain until they are indistinguishable from the cliffs they once opposed. Forgotten towns, surrendered by necessity, dissolve into ghostly absence, their outlines drawn only in scattered stone and the shifting murmur of waves. Every abandoned shoreline carries with it layers upon layers of memory. Roads bending into seaweed gardens. Piers encrusted with coral where no ships return. Cemeteries where once we placed our dead now swallowed, their markers scattered or buried in sand. And these remnants, these material fragments of grief and daily life, become ground down into anonymity. Concrete softened to gravel. Bone to calcium mingled with shells. Wood dissolved into currents, transmuted into invisible carbon. Entropy reclaims all as if saying gently, even memory must become sand. Geology hides no sympathy here. The ocean is tireless in its revision. Each wave rewrites the coastline with indifferent patience. Deltas retreat, dunes migrate, cliffs collapse. Sediments move ceaselessly along littoral drifts, carrying echoes far from their origins. Chemistry records traces more faintly. Isotope signatures in mud may reveal storms. In shells may reveal shifts of salinity. But the individual stories, the laughter in courtyards, the lamplight ringing harbors, those leave no record here. They pass into silence, too fragile to withstand the tug of water. And yet, ghost coasts are not only loss. They are also transformation. Coral reefs may rise where temples stood. Schools of fish may weave through what were once marketplaces. New ecologies emerge from ruin, rewriting the meaning of coastlines again. Is it possible that this constant replacement is itself a form of memory? Not the kind that holds still, but the kind that carries forward, layering the traces of one life into another. Maybe what we call forgetting is only a different way of remembering, one that privileges continuity of form rather than continuity of narrative. The coast keeps no names, but keeps the rhythm of transformation. Still, the human desire resists erasure. We visit these ghost coasts, diving to glimpse drowned facades, salvaging artifacts smudged by salt, mapping ruins drawn faintly on the ocean floor. In these acts we seek permanence, but the ocean reminds us softly, nothing holds. Each decade the outlines blur further until even maps fail. Maybe we are not meant to hold them as fixed places, but as voices faint at first, steady if we listen, telling us not to mourn permanence but to honor impermanence itself. Could it be that memory is not a stone we place upon a grave, but the sand slipping away between waves? Not because it denies us, but because it teaches us about fragility, about surrender, about how deeply silence belongs to the story of Earth. Perhaps our ghost coasts are not empty but full of silt that was once harbor, full of calcium that was once flesh. All things layered and blended, indistinguishable in matter, inseparable in history. And as we lie awake beneath the gaze of the nearer moon, imagining these drowned places where footsteps vanish into currents, we feel again the hum of entropy below. Memory ground down to sediment. Towns softened into geology. Ghost coasts whispering not in monuments, but in sand. And yet, if even our shorelines, visible, inhabited, cherished, can slip so easily into silence, then what of identity itself? What happens when the sea does not simply erase our places, but reshapes our very sense of who we are, redrawing not only maps but the fragile boundaries of belonging? As seas take land, and land takes loss, identity begins to erode along with the stone. We are tied to coasts more deeply than we realize. Our cities grow there, our myths root there, our languages carry the salt of waves. And when the coast retreats, some of us retreat with it. Others stay and are taken, dissolved into sand, dispersed into silt. Identity is rarely stable. It shifts, like dunes, like currents. But under the hand of a moon twice as near, the change becomes more insistent, more rapid. Maps, those delicate illusions of permanence, would fail again and again. What was once border is now ocean. What was once belonging is now absence. Civilizations anchored to outlines traced in ink would be forced to redraw them, not once but endlessly. And in this constant revision, how long before borders themselves lose meaning? How long before belonging is no longer tied to land at all, but to the act of moving, retreating, readjusting with every tide? Perhaps in such a world, the concept of homeland no longer stands still, but flows, tidal, impermanent. Science reminds us that landscapes imprint culture. Climate cycles shape language, rivers shape economy, deserts shape myth. In isotope trails and pollen records we can trace migrations, slow drifts of people following water or fleeing drought. A stronger moon, with seas rising and retreating too quickly, would press migrations into every century, maybe every decade. Civilizations would fracture not because of war, but because of transience. Groups scattered inland, dispersing with every cardiac pulse of the ocean. Is it possible that human identity, instead of being geographic, would become entirely temporal, rooted not in place but in rhythms and seasons, in the memory of tides rather than the permanence of land? Entropy hums through this vision. Individual names fade, monuments surrender, regions transform, until what remains are only echoes of movement. We may read them faintly in future sediments, trails of carbon isotopes, residue of industry, lines of pollen from displaced crops. But the narratives connected to these traces, the sense of self, the belonging and memory, are silenced. Entropy erodes identity as surely as waves erode stone. Not suddenly, but relentlessly, until what was once clear dissolves into indifference. Yet silence itself carries wonder. If identity becomes less rigid, less bound to fixed borders, perhaps it becomes lighter. A surrender instead of a conquest. We may lose the illusion of stillness, but we may gain the wisdom of movement. Understanding we are not nations pressed on maps, but tides of people caught in larger tides of water, caught in the largest tide of all, the moon's embrace. Maybe this dissolving is not only loss, but an invitation to humility, to see ourselves not as exceptions to erosion, but as participants in it. Identity, like geology, is carved by forces larger than itself. Cliffs do not choose their outline, dunes do not cling to shape, and civilizations cannot indefinitely hold their contours when shorelines slide away. We imagine permanence in maps, but the continents themselves are rafts, drifting on mantle currents, colliding and breaking in intervals of deep time. Could it be that our borders now are already ghosts, outlines destined to erode beneath new suns and closer moons? Perhaps who we are is never where we stand, but how we carry ourselves when the place beneath us is taken. So the moon pulls not only at water, but at us, at memory, at belonging, at identity itself. And as maps dissolve, as coasts are redrawn, as nations dissolve into movements instead of lines, we are left with difficult questions. What traces of ourselves will endure, and what shadows of perception will multiply around us as we live beneath a moon that feels larger, closer, inescapable? And if identity itself dissolves under the pull of tides, if the places that rooted us surrender to water and the very outlines of belonging blur, then what of the sky above us, the anchor we cannot touch, yet cannot escape? For though only one moon exists, its nearness would make it feel doubled, its presence overwhelming, its face present everywhere at once. To live beneath a closer moon would be to live under an illusion, as though two bodies, not one, watch us from the heavens. It would be a trick of perception more than astronomy. The moon magnified across the horizon would seem larger than awareness can hold. Its sheer presence might splinter into echoes, appearing in thought where it is absent, casting itself into reflections, windows, even imaginations of the mind. Every lake, every puddle, every glass pane would carry its image with a force that feels inescapable. Could it be that under such constant exposure, we would believe we lived not under a single satellite but under two, one written in the sky, the other reflected in us, doubling itself until separation falters? Psychology offers its quiet clues. We know that proximity exaggerates presence. The closer a face, the harder it is to ignore. The nearer a sound, the more it takes command of attention. A nearer moon would be like this, a luminous intimacy so oppressive yet so familiar that it becomes the background of thought. Every story we tell, every dream we breathe, would hold its afterimage. Maybe our inner lives would not belong entirely to us anymore, but to this enormous companion, too close to feel distant, too vast to feel intimate. Night itself would transform beneath this illusion. Shadows would sharpen, overlapping and blurring, doubling even as they fall. Trees would no longer cast single silhouettes, but twin tracings over grass and sand. Faces in firelight would seem haunted, as though echoed by another version of themselves. Is it possible, then, that the sense of self would split under these nights, pulled into dualities? One lived in reality, the other lived under the mirror of silver gaze. Not because we choose it, but because perception itself is shaped by gravity, vision compelled to see more than it can truly hold. In science, illusions of doubling already appear. The shimmer of stars through the atmosphere splits their light into twin images. Heat waves ripple landscapes, bending them into mirages. With the moon so near, its light more insistent, these illusions would spread into psychology, into memory itself. Could we begin to misremember whether the moon was seen once or twice, above us or within us, distant or pressing near? Perhaps the illusion of two would become as natural as the truth of one. The boundary between reality and imagination softened by nearness until we no longer cared to divide them. Yet there is tenderness in this illusion. For to see the moon doubled is to be reminded that perception is always more than fact. We live not in the world as it is, but in the world as we experience it. And in this doubled moon, always present, always reflecting, perhaps we would be taught a lesson about constancy, about how nothing can be ignored when it presses close enough. Would we learn to live lighter, carrying ourselves through the weight of constant watchfulness? Or would we become heavier, identities shadowed by an endless reminder that we are never unwitnessed? Maybe not. The larger question lingers softly. Does the double moon illusion belong only to the sky, or also to us? Do we not walk already with dual selves, the one we live within, and the one reflected outward, doubled into memory, into perception, into the eyes of those who watch us? Perhaps the nearer moon only reveals this truth, giving the heavens the shape that already resides silently inside us. And yet, if even the sky can be made to seem doubled, if illusions grow indistinguishable from memory, what of the climate itself, the air we breathe, the pattern of weather reshaped by a moon's closer gravity? Could it be that atmosphere, too, is caught in a silver net, every storm and breeze pulled into stranger patterns than we know? Would stronger tides not only stir the seas, but twist the sky above them, bending storms, rains, and deserts into patterns unfamiliar to us? Perhaps climate itself, long thought of as the dominion of the sun and earth alone, would reveal itself as lunar poetry, written in invisible weaving across the oceans, then breathed upward into the winds. The moon does not shine by its own light, yet shapes our world profoundly. Already, it pulls waters across basins, slow circulations of warmth and cold that form the hidden skeleton of climates. With the moon twice as near, that skeleton would stretch differently. Oceans would churn more violently, their currents accelerated, overturning deeper waters more often, carrying heat and nutrients to places long accustomed to stillness. Monsoons might grow stranger, longer, pulled not only by seasonal heat but by tides that roar higher into estuaries. Deserts might shift as trade winds bend to new patterns, arid belts redrawn, their boundaries taken farther inland or pushed back toward the sea. Even the rains, tender as they seem, would follow new rhythms, their timing no longer steady but straying, like songs made unfamiliar by the harmony of gravity. Science traces this with quiet care. Climate leaves its signatures in oxygen isotopes, in bubbles trapped in ice, in layers of sediment pressed patiently into stone. Within them are stories of ancient shifts, cataclysms and subtle swings alike. Times when climates bent quickly, and deserts became seas, or seas retreated into wastelands of dust. If the moon rested closer, tugging more tightly on waters, we would see such changes written more often, more urgently. Records of atmospheric change would harden rapidly into stone, their clues thickly layered until epochs blurred into one another like overwriting too soon upon a page not yet dry. Could it be that future geologists would struggle to tell one climate from the next, their patterns frantic, indistinguishable, written too quickly for clarity to endure? And yet, perhaps we would learn to feel differently beneath such skies. The predictability we cling to, the expectation of seasons tidy, rains scheduled, would vanish. But within the uncertainty, there is still rhythm. The storms would come, then pass. Though deserts march, rains would follow somewhere. Maybe cultures would grow into the rhythm of tides as much as into the warmth of sun. Maybe calendars would no longer bind themselves to months or seasons, but to cycles of atmosphere, to storms and calm repeating, to weathers as alive as the moon that pulls them. There is humility here, too. For as the moon's pull grows stronger, the idea of control weakens. We see clearly that climate has never been ours to command. It is the weaving together of earth, ocean, sky, and gravity. A net drawn not by human hands but by the silent mathematics of orbits. To step outside under the storms of this nearer moon would be to sense that net, its presence wrapping around us like some vast woven fabric, each gust of wind and drop of rain a thread pulled tight by the silver orb above. And what does this mean for memory? If climate itself shifts faster, less predictable, identity too becomes more fluid. The places where people dwell bend quickly beneath drought or monsoon. Entire languages tied to rhythms of rain may falter, songs of harvest may be forgotten, replaced by new chants for new seasons. Belonging erodes further, reshaped by storms and deserts that do not wait. Perhaps memory itself grows lighter here, no longer preserved in the cycles of annual predictability, but washed constantly, like sand, into patterns we cannot hold. Maybe not. Perhaps the moon only reminds us of what was always true, that climate has always been in motion, that nothing about sky or sea waits for permanence. We have simply lived in a narrow stillness, mistaking it for stability. A closer moon would reveal what the Earth already knows, that the planet is woven of change, that climate is not a rule, but a tide. And yet, if climate itself can be pulled into new tempos by the moon's strength, if monsoons, deserts, and rains can be rearranged like words upon a page, what then of extinction, the silencing of entire species, under this new rhythm of survival and disappearance? For life, as resilient as it is, always carries thresholds. There are cycles it can endure, and there are rhythms it cannot follow. When seas rise too swiftly, when storms repeat too often, when tides strike higher each day with unrelenting insistence, some lives adapt, while others dissolve into absence. Extinction is not always sudden. Sometimes it is a quiet fading, like the erosion of cliffs, like the slow retreat of sands. Species disappear not with spectacle, but with slowness. Fewer and fewer born, fewer and fewer surviving, until what was once abundant grows rare, and what was rare is gone. With a moon closer and tides more violent, this fading would be written along every coastline. Bands of absence would layer silently into sediments, archive lines not of presence, but of loss. Each band a marker of lives that could not keep pace with turning water. Each silence pressed into stone beside the fossils of those who endured. Already, our rocks bear memories of such times. Epochs of sudden climatic shifts, sharp intervals when sea levels rose, or atmospheres thickened, or continents drowned. We see them in isotope trails that mark disruptions in oxygen cycles, in thin layers of ash or dust where something ended quickly. In some places, mass extinctions carved gaps like pages missing from a book. In others, new species appeared almost immediately after silence, as though life itself insists on rewriting as soon as it is unwritten. Could it be that a closer moon would press these extinctions, these erasures, faster upon the page? Whole ecosystems compressed into narrow layers, their songs drowned out before they fully formed. Yet extinction is more than absence, it is also transformation. When reefs crumble, fish scatter into other niches. When marshes drown, new estuaries form in their place. Even as the moon erases, it creates. Even as it drowns, it offers new ground, sculpting habitats unfamiliar but alive. Creator and destroyer both. The moon becomes a tide for life itself, pulling continuously at the edge of survival, demanding adaptation to its tempo. Perhaps this is the story of survival under a nearer moon, that life would not march in steady continuity, but lurch in intervals. Sudden vanishings, sudden emergences, each echoing the pull of tides. But if extinction is written so strongly at the shore, what of the creatures who live far from coasts? Inland forests, deserts, tundras, would they too escape? Not entirely, for all ecosystems, however distant, are touched by oceans. Stronger currents mean more carbon carried, more heat distributed, more storms moving. Even the thickness of atmosphere changes slowly with altered circulation. Rains reach different soils. Winds cross deserts differently. Every biome becomes entangled in threads of tide. Every life is, in some way, tidal. None can remain fully apart. And what of us, beneath this tidal mirror? Do we, too, face extinction under its pull? History shows that humanity adapts quickly, finds ways to yield and persist. But perhaps extinction here is not only a biological erasure, but a cultural one. Entire languages might fade with their homelands drowned. Myths rooted in vanished seasons might lose meaning. Identities carved by coastlines might dissolve as those coasts themselves wash away. Perhaps extinction here is also forgetting who we were, forgetting the rhythms that once guided us, forgetting songs that cannot be translated into the new pace of seas. Maybe not. Perhaps memory itself is stronger, surviving even when matter fails, carried inward like tides drawn into shells, carried onward in stories whispered inland. Yet the melancholy remains. To live under a nearer moon is to face an Earth more insistent on reminding us that nothing is permanent. Not even species, not even stories, not even us. And still, if extinction leaves its bands in silence, it also builds archives, layering its losses deep beneath waves and into mud. What we cannot keep may one day be uncovered by others, pressed into stone, waiting almost patiently to be found. And yet, if loss can be folded into archives, if even absence can be stored beneath the sea, then what does that mean for the drowned edge of continents themselves? The vast, hidden libraries of fossils, ruins, and technofossils layered beneath waters so deep they are almost memory itself? For when tides grow stronger, higher, more insistent, everything carried away from the surface, stone, bone, artifact, fragment, is drawn down into the slow-turning shelves of Earth's seabed. The drowned fringe of the continents becomes an archive, not permanent, not complete, but a library nonetheless, written in pages of mud and salt. We might imagine the shelf of the ocean as a vast table, where fragments come to rest. Dust from deserts drifts here. Shells from plankton fall like snow into silence. Bones, crumbled from shorelines, are carried outward and down, layering themselves beside technofossils, the plastic remnants and traces of steel and glass. In this strange companionship, the natural and the artificial settle together. Ammonites beside polymers, corals beside concrete, trilobites beside circuitry. No hierarchy, no distinction that time will honor. All of it pressed equally, all of it archived quietly into the shifting shelves of oceanic memory. Science helps us glimpse this quiet accumulation. Sediments carry isotopes of carbon, telling of ancient atmospheres. Ash layers speak of vanished eruptions. Microfossils in clay layers whisper of climates warmer, colder, different from now. And in newer strata, fragments of us, chemical fingerprints of combustion, plastics broken into pellets, radioactive particles that no natural geology scripted, all sleep within these same layers. If the moon presses closer, with tides more restless, this process would accelerate. More cliffs would crumble, more cities would drown, more fragments would slide quickly toward the shelf. Pages would turn faster in this oceanic book, piling one disruption upon the next. Could it be that our age, ephemeral as it feels, will leave behind the heaviest and thickest chapter of all? Yet, like any archive, this one is imperfect. Much of what enters is erased again. Subduction drags whole shelves downward into the mantle, cycling memory into heat. Writing is consumed and rewritten in magma. Entire coastlines vanish without trace, their records folded deep into Earth's body. The archive beneath the waves is less a library of reference than a book of disappearance. Pages inked almost as quickly as they are torn away. To imagine the drowned edge of continents as an eternal archive would be illusion. It is not eternity that lives here, but the slower rhythm of forgetting. And still, there is comfort in the idea that nothing is completely lost. Even as pages vanish, whispers remain. A fossil imprint of scales, a pollen grain encased in silt, a shard of pottery lodged in clay. Each is a fragment, a letter rather than a sentence, but a letter nonetheless. And stitched together much later, they might speak louder than we intended, telling of lives that passed, of civilizations that vanished, of epochs we believed were lost. Perhaps the archive itself is not silence, but conversation, carried across eons, one faint fragment answering another. What then does it mean for us, to live knowing that most of what we build will sink here, into these shadowed shelves? Not because we are ignored, not because we are unworthy, but because gravity writes every story downward, toward silence. Our memories, our artifacts, our cities, all drawn into sediment to be sifted by deep currents, folded into eventual stone. In this way, memory is not something we carry, but something released, something surrendered to the seabed. Maybe this is the truer memory. Not what we hold, but what we let fall. Could it be that the drowned archive is the deepest mirror of who we are? Imperfect, incomplete, constantly erasing itself, and yet unable to resist the instinct to keep even a fragment? Not because fragments last forever, but because fragments are enough. Enough to remind any who come after that something was here. Something left its whisper on the clay before moving on. And yet, if even the archives beneath the waves refuse permanence, if entropy wears away even memory's most careful layers, what, then, does that tell us of the greater law that governs all things? The momentum of collapse, the entropy of civilizations, the tendency for even the strongest identities of stone and steel to dissolve into ruin. And yet, if even the archives beneath the waves refuse permanence, if silence can gather even in stone, what does that remind us of but the greater law that waits beneath all things, the slow persistence of entropy? At the edge of land where ocean meets stone, where tides carve endlessly at what we call solid, entropy speaks loudest. It is here, beneath a nearer moon, that collapse finds its rhythm. Each tide is not only a rising, not only a retreat, but another line in the poem of dissolution. Ruins scattered, identities blurred, landscapes consumed and remade. Entropy is not cruel. It is not vengeful. It does not destroy in anger. It simply unfolds as gravity unfolds, as tides unfold. A principle woven into the fabric of existence. At the shore, intensified by stronger tides, we see its handwriting made more legible. Walls collapse sooner, piers fracture more quickly, cliffs surrender to the surf in a fraction of the time they once held. Temples once raised to endure now soften, their stones turning back to sand, their carvings blurred into unreadable whispers. Not because meaning is worthless, but because matter itself is restless, forever seeking dispersal. Science reveals this clearly. Particles move not toward order, but toward greater randomness. Geology shows us it in crumbling cliffs, chemistry in decaying isotopes, biology in bodies that return to soil. The moon, nearer, accelerates the principle, coaxing faster change at every boundary it touches. A coastline is no longer a border but a process, ceaselessly rewritten by the push and drag of entropy at work. Could it be that the shore itself is not a place, but a reminder that everything we see is temporary, every form destined one day to settle into formlessness? And yet, there is strange comfort in this. For entropy is not silence alone, but transformation. The collapse of stone feeds the sand that feeds the shore that shelters new life. The erosion of identity gives rise to new selves, new adaptations, new language and song. If entropy is the great scattering, it is also the great possibility. Every ruin is a resource. Every failure becomes part of another form. Perhaps this is why entropy speaks loudest in the tidal zone, because here, at the edge of land and water, collapse and creation are always simultaneous. Still, we ask, what of memory? If ruins become sand, if archives dissolve into mud, if fossils are swallowed before they harden, what survives? Maybe only echoes, a scattering of patterns too faint to serve as permanence, but enough to remind us that something once was. Memory may be no fortress, only a tidal pool, fragile and temporary, filled at one moment, emptied the next, yet always returning with a new tide. Could it be that memory is not erasure's opposite, but erasure's partner, each giving the other meaning in the endless rhythm of presence and absence? Standing at the edge of water, we feel the vastness of entropy. A tower dissolves, a language dies, a coastline recedes. Every collapse is another reminder that we are caught within the same unfolding. Our lives, our civilizations, are quick tides against the patience of entropy. Maybe not. Perhaps what we call loss is only a shift of form. Perhaps identity was never meant to stay still. Perhaps illusion, too, is a necessary shape of memory. Beneath the colossal moon, closer than ever, entropy is no longer hidden. It shows itself in every collapse. It sharpens its lesson in each shoreline consumed. And still, we keep building, keep naming, keep wanting to endure. That, too, is part of the rhythm, not defiance but participation. We scatter like shells, we layer like sediments. We erode like cliffs. We are written, then rewritten into the edge of Earth. And yet, if entropy speaks most clearly at the water's edge, erasing and rewriting in equal measure, what then of the moon itself? The luminous mirror in the sky, closer now, holding not only our tides and ruins but also our reflections, returning our gaze as if to remind us of something deeper? For a nearer moon becomes not just a satellite circling in silence, but a mirror held against us, reflecting not only light but the impermanence of all that lives. In its silver face, we glimpse not only craters and scars from forgotten impacts, but our own fragility, returned to us as if from another world. The moon has always been a mirror of sorts, sending back the sun's light in muted glow. But when it hovers closer, its presence overwhelms. It does not only illuminate the night. It lifts something inward from us, returning our gaze with steady, patient watchfulness. To look at this nearer moon would be to see both outward and inward all at once. In its mirrored brightness lies truth, that we are not separate from the forces that move seas and seasons, but inscribed within them, bound as thoroughly as water is bound to gravity. Its pull is physical, pulling tides, crust, even air, and yet it is existential, too, pulling thought, memory, and the quiet recognition of our own impermanence. The scars on its surface are stories Earth has been spared, evidence of ancient collisions, of violent arrivals, of matter fractured and reformed. The moon carries them openly, records that never erode for want of atmosphere. In its face, permanence and impermanence intersect. The permanence of scars that never fade, the impermanence of the worlds those impacts destroyed. We see in it a truth of entropy made timeless, that everything waits for transformation, whether collapse is fast or slow. To look at the nearer moon would be to see entropy magnified, a reflection of both survival and loss aching across the face of the sky. For humanity, such closeness alters more than light. It presses against the psyche, entering not only dreams but waking thought. To live always beneath that luminous eye might make us question differently. Who are we in the face of something so persistent? Who are we, knowing that it reflects our fragility from above, even as it tugs at our oceans and slows our days? Could it be that every act of building, every act of remembering, would feel haunted by its mirror, reminding us that nothing resists erasure, that even identity is a tide drawn outward and returned, shifted into something unrecognizable but still continuous? Science, too, folds into this reflection. Gravity does not only tug water but stretches Earth's body itself, bending it subtly, flexing its crust. Isotope trails written in sediments whisper of these altered patterns. Storms, deserts, currents, all bend within the moon's net. And in observing these truths, we might realize we are no different. Our breathing is tidal. Our memory is tidal. Our very sense of self is pulled first outward, then back inward again, guided by a force neither merciful nor cruel, but steady. Entropy reshapes all, and the nearer moon makes that reshaping visible. Perhaps, then, the closer moon becomes a teacher. Its reflection not only shows permanence failing, but impermanence enduring. Because though cliffs dissolve and temples crumble, though species vanish in tidal erasure, the rhythms continue. The tides never stop. The light never fails to return. The moon itself has been broken, scarred, fragmented, yet it remains, not as it was, but as it became. And perhaps so will we. Not unchanged, not immortal, but reflective. Reflected through entropy just as the moon reflects the sun. Maybe not. Perhaps the nearer moon overwhelms, reminding us too often of how fragile we are, how easily erased. Or perhaps it comforts, assuring us that we do not vanish entirely, that even in collapse, something survives as reflection, if only mirrored briefly in stone, in tide, in the face of a world that has watched us since before memory. And yet, if the moon draws us outward in its reflected gaze, and returns us inward to these questions of impermanence, What then of the world it shapes beneath? If identity, history, and reflection bend beneath its pull, then what kind of planet emerges, fluid and unsteady, under its doubled tether? A planet not of still shores, but of shifting maps, a world of ceaseless transformation, forever remaking itself? For under a nearer moon, Earth itself becomes a planet of shifting shores. No coastline remains still. No map survives more than a generation before it is drained or drowned. After centuries of this repetition, humanity cannot resist, cannot demand, cannot hold fast. We learn instead to adjust. Cultures become more fluid, less tethered to stone markers, more attuned to the moving horizon. Settlements rise like tides along rivers and edges, only to fold back inland when seas consume them, then advance once more in seasons of retreat. Architecture softens from permanent walls into structures meant to move or wash away. Perhaps, after a time, permanence itself becomes a forgotten ambition. Our wisdom turns instead toward nomadism, toward redundancy, toward reflecting the impermanence of the world. Science, too, is reshaped within this transience. Archaeology would find few concentrated ruins, but many scattered ones. Layer upon layer of drowned sites would become common, each swallowed and replaced quickly, each leaving a trace within sediments rather than in surviving stone. Isotope trails, traces of fires and materials, would be our lingering footprints. Our memory would be less monumental, less reliant on fixed cities, and more on patterns of adaptation, of moving inland, of returning. Could it be that a humanity so shaped would abandon its obsession with borders, with rigid maps, and create instead cultures tied only to rhythm? Maybe the length of generations would be measured not in years, but in the cycles of seas advancing and retreating. In such a world, knowledge would change its voice. Instead of carving words into stone or binding them into pages kept dry in vaults, wisdom might be carried orally again, entrusted to memory and story, designed to move with communities, never left behind to drown. Songs, myths, chants could take precedence over hierarchies of writing. Humanity might rediscover older forms of transmission, language woven into rhythm, repeated enough to survive across centuries even after towns and libraries fail by water. Could it be that the moon's insistence on flux returns us not to fragility, but to resilience, teaching us that memory survives best when it is not fastened to place, but carried by voice, breath, and pattern? And still, the planet itself learns to yield. Valleys not only host rivers but grow into tideways. Hills become islands, then vanish, then return in new forms. The continents, too, have always shifted. Tectonics remind us of this. Plates colliding, land sinking into mantle, crust born again at ridges. But under a nearer moon, that same truth descends into a faster tempo, notable within shorter spans of time. The Earth, once thought patient, reveals it was fluid all along. We only mistook slowness for permanence. Yet there is a gentleness within this ceaseless transformation. To live on shifting shores may feel unstable, but it is also grounding in its humility. It teaches us that we are not rulers of geography but participants in motion. That to survive is not to fix a boundary but to move with it. Maybe the wisdom of this world is not architectural grandeur but cultural humility. Not conquest of land, but acceptance of its withdrawal. The true monument, then, is not the temple or city but the adaptability itself, the soft willingness to ebb and return with the sea. Perhaps this is the lesson Earth learns again. That to live is to yield. To be fluid does not mean to vanish, but to remain differently. And just as a shoreline dissolves to be drawn again, we too dissolve and redraw, in identity, in memory, in form. And yet, if Earth itself can accept fluidity, if even continents and civilizations consent to shift and soften, what then finally remains when all movement bends inward, when all existence reflects back upon impermanence? If the moon's nearness teaches us to yield, what is left, when all has yielded? At the end, the question is quiet but insistent. What survives, when the moon moves closer? What endures in the face of tides that erase, in storms that scatter, in valleys drowned and plains consumed? Perhaps we look first to matter, to sand, the simplest archive, ground fine from the bodies of cliffs, shells, and ruins alike. Sand endures as fragments when structures collapse, as countless grains whispering of what was once monumental. Sand flows across centuries, reshaping but persisting. It is presence without structure, memory without form, survival as endurance in dispersion. Perhaps what remains of us, of all things, is not the shape we hold but the fragments we leave to flow. And then to stone, the slower keeper. Within strata, fossils harden, isotopes record climates, extinctions mark themselves in thin layers of silence. Not every life, not every culture enters stone, but enough to tell the story. That here there was life, fragile and persistent all at once. That even under collapse, memory sometimes seeps downward and finds a way to sleep inside Earth's crust. Stone holds fragments longer than language, but even stone is swallowed eventually by subduction, drawn into magma, returned to the great forgetting. Still, for a time, stone remembers. But what of memory itself, memory not as matter, but as the intangible echo held within thought, voice, and song? Perhaps nothing survives there as permanence. Perhaps it survives only in pattern, repeating itself in new forms. A story dissolves in one tongue, only to resurface in another. A myth drowns at one coast and reawakens inland, carried as rhythm, as archetype, as repetition. Maybe memory is not meant to fix itself, but to move, shifting like water from vessel to vessel, surviving not because it resists erasure but because it mirrors it. And still there is loss, for in the shadow of a nearer moon, much cannot keep pace. Coastal species vanish, languages scatter, generations forget names once tied to land now erased. Cultures melt into tides as surely as cliffs into sand. The closer moon does not choose this erasure. It simply pulls, steadily, without intention. Loss is not chosen, but it is real, and it hangs over every cycle of presence and absence. It is possible that what remains is never enough to retell what has been lost. It is possible memory is always partial, always incomplete. Yet even so, there is persistence. Life does not vanish at once. It adjusts, fractures, reforms, recycles. Human lives, too, weave themselves again with each collapse, carrying fragments forward into new forms of being. Persistence is not triumph, not permanence, but the willingness to continue in another shape. A nearer moon may remind us relentlessly of fragility, but within fragility hides resilience. All things break, and still all things continue as something else. Physicists tell us that entropy is the law of dispersal, the drift toward greater randomness. But even within entropy patterns persist. Spirals and galaxies, cycles and climates, rhythms and tides. What remains is not structure but pattern. Repetition, recurrence, echo. A nearer moon pulls us harder into this recognition, showing us that everything dissolves, and yet everything continues in some other form, some other rhythm. So what survives, then, when the moon moves closer? Perhaps not monuments, not borders, not maps drawn in ink. Perhaps not even languages or cities as we imagine them now. What remains is pattern. Sand as the body scattered, stone as the archive deepened, memory as repetition, loss as its own teacher. What remains is fragility etched into persistence, the paradox that we are both endlessly vulnerable and endlessly carried forward in fragments. Maybe this is what the moon has been whispering all along. Not permanence, but endurance. Not defiance, but surrender. A closer moon shows us not just another Earth, but a mirror. One that reflects how fragile we are, and how persistent we are within that fragility. Not unchanged, not eternal, but endlessly reshaped, endlessly reflected. And yet, if this much can remain, fragile and scattered though it is, what else might we have forgotten still waits beneath the pull of tides? A quieter Earth hidden beneath its surface, another archive we have not yet learned to read?